Now, I have a guest online, and normally we would agree on almost everything. He's from the Mises Institute. Ludwig von Mises is the namesake there. His name is Bob, or Robert Murphy. Mr. Murphy, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on the show. This is, by the way, if you didn't know, the gold standard in talk radio. And we are Austrians here ourselves, just like the Mises Institute. And now, normally, as I say, we should agree on everything, but we have one disagreement, and that has to do with the trade deficit. Before I get to our disagreements, and I'm sure we'll have some interesting things to share on that front, let's get to something we do agree on, and that is the deficit. Now, you wrote a commentary not too long ago saying that the deficit, the ratio between the debt and the deficit, the debt and GDP, as long as that to remain constant, that in this case, if you divide 14, let's lose round numbers, 14 divided by 15 is about 93%. In order for that to maintain its constant ratio, that if GDP increases 5% in nominal terms, then we could multiply by 93%, and that's how much the debt can grow. And how are we doing on that front? First comment on that. So according to my calculations, we can grow our debt about 4.65% of the economy. Right now, we're about 10% plus of the economy. So would you want to make a quick comment on the trajectory of our debt?
Well, sure. So, yeah, just to make sure your listeners understand the point, what I was making the argument that the apologists, the people who are saying that, oh, it's no big deal, we're a growing economy, it's fine, they try to say that, look, you can run perpetual budget deficits because of the growing economy, that can keep the as you were saying, the ratio of the total, number, the size of the debt in terms of absolute dollars relative to GDP. If you just keep that stable, they're saying, what's the big deal? But the point is that at the rate that they're running deficits right now, like you say, 10% of the economy, thereabouts, that translates into, with the way the economy grows, the debt would have to be something like 3 times GDP in order for that to stabilize. So the point is, even using the sort of cheating methodology whereby you say we just want to stabilize the debt to GDP ratio, we're still running deficits that are way too big. And even looking at the recent projections by the White House over the next 10 years as to what they think the deficits will be if their budget proposals go through, again, it just has soaring debt, not only in absolute terms, but even relative to the economy. So clearly, it's unsustainable. Well,
to keep the deficit to GDP ratio constant, we'd have to increase the deficit as a percentage of the economy around 5%. To keep that ratio constant at 93, and it's double that or more. That's the point. That's what I thought the point of your article was.
Well, yeah, exactly right. It was just saying that it's true that even so. I mean, a lot of people think, look, to get the debt situation under control, you need to balance the budget, and I agree with that. And I think that's what we should be doing.
Right. Or
even running surpluses, better yet. But I'm saying that a lot.
I don't want the government to have any. I don't want the government surpluses. I don't want them to have any money.
Well, that's okay. That's even better.
Okay, so let's get to something else. Let's get something else that I wanted to touch on. You wrote something called 3 Flawed Fed Exit Options, and I wrote something years ago. Not years, I guess a year and a half, 2 years ago. I guess that's years. No exit for Ben. And we have some similar points, but let's go through the options for, I call him Banana Ben, but you call him Mr. Bernanke. Right now, if Ben was to unwind his balance sheet was around $900 billion. Now it's going to be about I think it's $2.5 trillion. So there's a huge increase in the Fed's balance sheet. But in order to unwind that, or to have some kind of exit, he has 3 options. And option 1, you say, is pay higher interest rates on excess reserves. So you want to touch on that option for our listeners?
Well, sure, and that's the one that Bernanke himself, when people press him and say, what are you going to do if price inflation starts getting out of hand? That's what he says. Oh, we could just, in 2 minutes, I could call up somebody and we'll bump up the interest rate on excess reserves. So what that means is, all the massive purchases they've been making, that's been flooding the banking system with more reserves. And in normal circumstances, the banks would just lend those out, and multiply on top of them. That hasn't been happening for various reasons this time around. And so right now there's over $1 trillion in excess reserves sitting in the banking system.
And thank God for that, because if those excess reserves were to turn into required reserves, we'd blow up the money supply astronomically, correct?
Right. If the banks, so I mean, loosely speaking, that means that the banks legally had the ability to lend out another $9 trillion or so, round numbers. Of just,
it's actually a lot created. More. But is it Bob or Robert? How do you want to be called?
I can go by Bob.
Okay. So Bob, it's actually not that number. It's actually a lot more, because we don't have a 10% reserve system anymore. We have a 10% reserve system on demand deposits, but on time deposits there are no requirements. It's zero. So, you could have a very small monetary base, one that's not growing, as we had in the earlier part of this decade, and have bank lending go bonkers.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Depending on the configuration of it, that trillion in reserves that are sitting there free and clear, yeah, they could support many multiples of that.
Right, as long as you have the capital. But then we have the Basel III coming out. I don't want to get in the weeds with that, but there's banks also have a bank capital restrictions, so they have that going against them too. But now. So
as far as the excess reserves, I mean, the interest, so Bernanke's solution is, he says, right now we're paying 25 basis points.
Right, quarter of 1%.
Yeah, for keeping those excess reserves on deposit with the Fed. And so he's saying we could just, if we had to, if those started leaking out, meaning that banks started lending to their customers with those reserves, Bernanke's saying we could just bump up the interest rate that we're paying.
Yeah, but to what? Let's just say they bump it up, okay? So essentially what he's saying is it's going to take a lot longer to unwind my balance sheet, okay? So the balance sheet is unwinding anyway through natural cause. Treasuries mature and MBS, mortgage-backed securities mature, so it would naturally unwind, but the Fed is actually increasing the balance sheet. So they're actually printing money and expanding their balance sheet to make up for those reserves that would naturally be winding down, and then buying even more to increase the balance. So if he pays more money on reserves, he's not unwinding the reserves, he's actually increasing the reserves.
Right, and that's my whole point. I mean, that's just the epitome of kicking the can down the road and making the problem worse. If the problem is we've got $1 trillion plus in excess reserves sitting there, what do we do with this so it doesn't leak out and cause price inflation? How in the world is it a solution to that, to say, well, let's make that thing grow exponentially, which is what happens when the Fed starts paying interest on those reserves.
So right now the banks aren't really lending that much to the private sector to purchase capital goods. They're mostly lending money to the government. What happens if Treasury yields rise faster than the Fed is willing to pay reserves on their excess, pay interest on the excess reserves? Wouldn't the banks just keep on lending money to the government?
Right, that's exactly right. So I think once we get out of this little rut we're in and people start expecting price inflation, then you'll see rates rise and the Fed will have to raise interest rates.
The other two options were, and real quickly, you could pull reserves out of the system. That's my favorite thing to do, but that has a lot of consequences. So when you come back, I want to touch really briefly on the trade deficit, but you're a great guest. Please come back. This is the gold standard in talk radio, and this is Michael Pento.
Get up on your knees, brothers, sisters, to get your freedom, standing tall.
Peter Schiff is back on the air.
Okay, let's get right into it, because we have to really cover a lot of ground in 9-10 minutes with Bob Murphy from the Ludwig von Mises Institute. Okay, so let's real quick end up with these options for the Federal Reserve. Okay, he can increase reserve requirements, correct, Bob? Now that essentially would be like taking away all of what they put in. Correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so what do you think the ramifications of saying, okay, you had reserves, now those reserves, they haven't been loaned out, they were excess, now they're required, you can't loan out those reserves, or a great percentage of those reserves. What do you think happens in that case?
Well, that would devastate the banks, and I mean, that doesn't mean that's a wrong thing to do. I'm just trying to say that's no panacea, that... Yeah, I mean, because those banks right now, they think those reserves are like cash to them. That's like $1 trillion they've got just sitting there that they can do something with if they need to. And so if the Fed comes along and says, oh, actually now those are required reserves,
right,
they're effectively no longer money as far as the banks are concerned because they can't do anything with it.
That might be the right thing to do.
That
might be the right thing to do, but they're not. They have. First of all, they haven't. The Federal Reserve hasn't touched reserve requirements in decades. I mean, it's something they very rarely do. I don't think it's even an option for Bernanke. And the other one you had was pull reserves out of the system. That's something I think all Austrians would love for him to do. It's the best option, but it has immediate consequences. The long term is wonderful, but immediately he's selling treasuries and some MBS and RMBS. That's going to raise interest rates dramatically, and it would collapse this economy that still hasn't recovered from its over-leveraged condition. Correct? We agree?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, now let's have a fight. We have cleared that out of the way. Now, so far you sound like a great guy. You have your economics grounded in sure footing. But you don't think the trade deficit is a problem. You don't think the current account, having a huge current account deficit is a problem because it's balanced by a capital account surplus. Can you explain that to me and our listeners?
Well, you're going to think I'm shying away from the fight, but that's actually, I don't think that anymore. I learned my lesson. So just to give you the context.
Are you kidding me?
No, it's
when did you learn that? When did you learn that lesson?
When everything blew up. So
I got to tell you something. I want to say I've been in business. I've been licensed for 19 years, and I have been on television and radio for 6 years, and I've never had the integrity, the pleasure of having someone with your integrity to admit they were wrong on air and said they learned from their mistakes. And I got to give you much homage and much kudos for saying that. Let's just start there.
Well,
but let's
thank you.
Let's just go back
so your listeners can understand, because what was happening, and it was with Peter Schiff, ironically, of course, as you know, that he was warning about the massive current account deficit, and I just wasn't looking at the big picture, and I was just saying at the time, I was thinking, well, no, I mean, there's nothing wrong with a trade deficit or a current account deficit per se, and I still believe that you could have a healthy economy that has a large current account deficit. I just don't think that's what's going on with our economy. That
okay,
if you had a really great policy.
Let's just bring some particulars in. So basically, when you have a current account deficit, you're not, and the biggest part of a current account deficit is your trade deficit. You're not selling, you're not exporting as much as you're importing. You're not paying for your imports with exports. So basically, you're sending pieces of paper overseas for the goods and services that they send here to their domestic economy. And plus, what happens is that the other part of the current account deficit is money's transferred over to the assets that they purchase. So if they own treasury bills, you're sending interest payments over. So that's your current account deficit, which is the larger portion of your trade deficit. So your argument had been, before you saw the light, that since those foreign owners of our currency have to buy something in the United States, that becomes for us a capital account surplus, and that balances the balance of payments.
Right. So just to make the argument, just so listeners can see, where could I have been coming from? Because when most people hear about the trade deficit, they think that what's driving it is that Americans are gluttonous and they're buying plasma screen TVs and cars from Japan and so on, and then no one wants to buy our stuff, and so the way we rectify it in terms of the accounting is we pile up debt. But the point I was making is that in theory, it's possible it could be the other way around, that, our economy is so great that foreigners around the world want to invest in us. They want to buy shares in our corporations, or they want to buy real estate, or what have you.
That's making a subjective, qualitative judgment on the current account deficit. That doesn't matter to me. I don't care if it's good, if you think it's good or you think it's bad, or some people think it's wonderful how anxious people are to invest in our country. The point is, it's very pernicious for our economy if it gets too high, and let's explain. So I could either grow a bushel of corn, just to be a specific example. I could grow a bushel of corn and sell it for a basket of widgets made in China. If I do that, now I've used my resources. I've grown corn. I put it in a bushel. I sent it overseas, and the Chinese have manufactured. They've taken their natural resources and manufactured some widgets, and we made the exchange. And there's no future obligation. It's over and done with. And the problem is If we don't pay for those widgets with something that we've produced, we send money overseas. That money comes back to us. Now what happens is instead of selling a bushel of corn, we sell a piece of the farm to them. We sell a piece of our country. So what is more beneficial to the United States? To sell a bushel of corn or a piece of a farm? That's issue number one. That's one of the deadly aspects of having a trade deficit. You're selling away pieces of your country. And here's where it gets even worse. Sometimes rather, and this is in most cases, rather than selling assets that have a non-ending revenue stream to foreign countries, but we end up selling them pieces of paper, IOUs, called treasury bonds. That means we've given them nothing. That means sometime in the future, we have to tax our productive capacity with interest and send it overseas. That's what makes it so deadly. Can you see the difference now?
Yes, I do see the difference. And again, just to give a nod to the other side, though, I mean, you can imagine, like, look, when a corporation is starting out, they might issue equity, right? And so in a sense, if you use the analogy to a country, that's like it would be running a current account deficit, that it would be taking in more money than it's producing in goods and services.
Right.
But, the fact that a corporation takes, issues equity and is selling off pieces of the company to outside investors, that by itself isn't a bad thing. Now, of course, if a corporation's in trouble and they're piling up debt because they just have an unsound business model, then that is a problem. So that's what I was saying, that, the United States in the 1800s, people in Great Britain were sending over capital to build railroads and things, and so it was like a magnet for capital investment. So I was saying that per se isn't a bad thing, but I totally agree now with the reason this is happening, I think, is because the Fed is printing money. And that's one of the main drivers of this. So, and I totally agree with you.
Fed is printing money because we're running huge debts. They're twin deficits. We're running huge deficits that are our budget deficit is financed by our trade deficit. And so
right.
that's
so
why
I totally agree with you that right now the current account deficit, and for the last 30 years, has been a sign that, yes, the U.S. economy is just setting itself up for recurring crashes.
Well, thank you so much, Bob Murphy. We're always welcome to see converts to our way of thinking. Thanks so much for joining us. Come on back. Final segment, final half hour, and this is the gold standard in talk radio.